Back in July of 1933, when David was still Prince of Wales, he had started expressing his sympathies towards Germany and its new Nazi-dominated government. In a letter to Prince Louis Ferdinand, the grandson of former German Kaiser Wilhelm II, he wrote, "It is no business of ours to interfere in Germany's internal affairs, either with Jews or with anything else. Dictators are very popular these days. We might want one in England before long." According to German historian Prof Karina Urbach, University of London, in the 1930s, David had been entertaining the idea of an Anglo-German alliance. This idea had been concocted with his pal, Charles Edward, Duke of Coburg, a German grandson of Queen Victoria, and a Nazi official. Shortly after David's accession to the throne as King Edward VIII, his sympathies were noted by the German ambassador to London, Leopold von Hoesch. King Edward quite generally feels warm sympathy for Germany. I have become convinced during frequent, often quite lengthy talks with him that his sympathies are deep-rooted and strong enough to withstand the contrary influences to which they are not seldom exposed. According to Conservative Member of Parliament Henry Channon, Edward's feelings went beyond a warm sympathy. In December of 1936, Channon wrote in his diary, "The king is going the dictator way and is pro-German against Russia and against too much slipshod democracy. I shouldn't be surprised if he aimed at making himself a mild dictator, a difficult enough task for an English king." On the German side, Albert Speer claimed Hitler himself said, "I am certain through him permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. If he had stayed, everything would have been different. His abdication was a severe loss for us." That said, on the one-time king side, he would later simply claim that he felt Germany would make a great ally against what he saw as the real threat the nation was facing at the time, communism in Russia and its potential spread. As he would later outline in 1966, recollecting back when he met with Hitler after abdicating his throne, "Hitler made me realize that Russia was the only enemy and that Great Britain and all of Europe had an interest in encouraging Germany to march against the East and to crush communism once and for all. I thought that we ourselves would be able to watch as the Nazis and the Reds would fight each other." His equerry, Dudley Forwood, would likewise write in his memoirs of the former king, present Duke, "Whereas the Duke, Duchess, and I had no idea that the Germans were or would be committing mass murder on the Jews, we were none of us averse to Hitler politically. We felt that the Nazi regime was a more appropriate government than the Weimar Republic, which had been extremely socialist." So rewinding back to his abdication of the throne, after having tossed aside his crown, the now styled Duke of Windsor and his new wife were given an invite to come tour German factories by the German Labor Front. Given the political climate at the time and that he was supposed to be keeping a low profile, as you can imagine, he was strongly advised not to go. However, much as he often did, he decided to do whatever he wanted anyway, often in this case suggested to be partially because Germany had extended the invitation very respectfully, right down to, upon arrival, referring to his wife as Her Royal Highness, an honorific the Duke was still sore his own brother had explicitly refused her. Having himself likewise been shunned from state functions on the home front, it's thought he also was interested in taking his new wife on such a stately tour, with originally the plan not just to tour Germany, but there was also a formal trip to the United States planned at this point as well. And so it was that in the summer of 1937, the Duke and Duchess very controversially traveled to Germany, where they toured factories and met with the likes of Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, and even Chief Silly Mustache himself. German interpreter Paul Schmidt would claim of Hitler and the Duke's meeting, Hitler was evidently making an effort to be as amicable as possible towards the Duke, whom he regarded as Germany's friend, having especially in mind a speech the Duke had made some years before, extending the hand of friendship to Germany's ex-servicemen's associations. In these conversations, there was, so far as I could see, nothing whatever to indicate whether the Duke of Windsor really sympathized with the ideology and practices of the Third Reich, as Hitler seemed to assume he did. Apart from some appreciative words for the measures taken in Germany in the field of social welfare, the Duke did not discuss political questions. But going back to the Duke's assistant, Forwood claims that after the conversation with Hitler, the Duke apparently was under the impression that Hitler was leaning towards pacifism, although noteworthy, this does not seem to jive with what the Duke himself would allege with regards to Hitler apparently being very open about his desire to take down communism in Russia. For whatever it's worth, Forwood would also claim that during his interactions with Hitler, Schmidt was seemingly intentionally mistranslating Hitler and the Duke's conversations at points, perhaps to smooth out the conversations between the two and any political differences they may or may not have had. That said, Forwood would also state, "My master said to Hitler, the Germans and the British races are one. They should always be one. They are of Hun origin." On that note, the Duke was notably very, let's just say overtly racist. For example, upon visiting Australia in 1920, writing of the native Australian people, "They are the most revolting form of living creature I've ever seen. They are the lowest known form of human beings and are the nearest thing to monkeys," among other similar remarks about various other groups. As for the Duke's opinion of Hitler, he would later claim in his memoirs that while he had great respect for the Germans, as for the former homeless artist himself, his impression after meeting Hitler was, "The Führer struck me as a somewhat ridiculous figure with his theatrical posturing and his bombastic pretensions." While the Duke had been riding something of a surge of popularity within the US for marrying an American, naturally, after the extremely controversial touring of Germany and seemingly butting up to the Nazis, the former plan to go do a similar visit to look over factories and labor practices in the United States had to be canceled owing to the backlash that resulted in America. The Duke did not exactly do himself any favors in some circles after in Britain or America either when, in May of 1939, he gave a speech delivered from Verdun, France, calling for appeasement, though this seemingly less to do with wanting an alliance with Hitler per se at this point, and more to do with trying to avoid, as he called it, the unending scenes of horror of war he personally witnessed during World War I, as well as his aforementioned thought that if they simply leave Hitler be, he'd take care of communism for everyone else. To quote the Duke, "I thought the rest of us could be fence-sitters while the Nazis and the Reds slogged it out." But going back to his 1939 speech, he stated, "I am deeply conscious of the presence of the great company of the dead, and I am convinced that could they make their voices heard, they would be with me and what I am about to say. I speak simply as a soldier of the last war, whose most earnest prayer it is that such cruel and destructive madness shall never again overtake mankind. There is no land whose people want war." The BBC received a recording of the speech and promptly filed it away, labeling it with "important, not to be broadcast." That said, millions elsewhere had heard it, and a transcript found its way back to Britain and was published in various newspapers in the country. From all this, a fascinating, if slightly nightmarish on some points, alternate history timeline is one where David chose not to marry Miss Simpson and instead remained king. Given both Hitler's obvious desire to buddy up to him and the king's inclination to keep Britain out of any such conflict with Nazi Germany, or even support them against the Russians, it's interesting to think how wildly history may have been different and how it all potentially turned on one man's love of his woman. Could Hitler have successfully overthrown Russia if he'd not had Britain to fight as well? And if Britain stayed neutral in the war, would the United States ever have joined the war efforts against Germany, or simply focused on Japan after Pearl Harbor? Noteworthy on that one, as we've covered before in our video on why did the Japanese join Nazi Germany during World War II, given Nazi ideology, the countries were not actually really allies in a practical sense. And indeed, even after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, most of the early efforts the US put forth were not against Japan, but directed at Germany, simply using Pearl Harbor as an excuse to push the country to join the war in Europe, even though Germany had had nothing to do with the attack. And again, Japan and Germany were allies mostly only in name, and leadership knew it. Indeed, Hitler was not even under any obligation to declare war on the United States when the US declared war on Japan. Whatever the case there, as for real history, at the start of World War II, the Duke was appointed Major General and assigned to the British military mission in France. However, he apparently was highly unsatisfied with such a position and in general despised the government of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. This fact was not lost on one Count Julius von Zech, German ambassador in the Netherlands. On January 27, 1940, Zech wrote about the Duke to Ernst von Weizsäcker, second in command to Germany's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. According to Zech, I might have the opportunity to establish certain lines leading to the Duke of Windsor. He has expressed himself in especially uncomplimentary terms about Chamberlain, who he particularly dislikes and who, as he thinks, is responsible for his being frozen out. Also, there seems to be something like the beginning of a fronde forming around Windsor, which for the moment of course still has nothing to say, but which at some time, under favorable circumstances, might acquire a certain significance. Now to clarify, Zech used the French term fronde, indicating a movement of protest, even rebellion against established leadership. Zech went on to explain how one of his intermediaries had made contact with the Duke while in London. I had explained to him through an intermediary why it is completely utopian for England to attempt to effect a change of regime in Germany, and the statements of my intermediary are believed to have made a certain impression on him, more in any case than those pitched in the contrary tone which he got at the same time from the group around Chamberlain. On February 19th, Zech sent a second letter to Weizsäcker. The Duke of Windsor has said that the Allied War Council devoted an exhaustive discussion at its last meeting to the situation that would arise if Germany invaded Belgium. Reference was made throughout to a German invasion plan said to have been found in an airplane that made a forced landing in Belgium. On the military side, it was held that the best plan would be to make the main resistance effort in the line behind the Belgian-French border, even at the risk that Belgium should be occupied by us. On March 2, 1940, Weizsäcker replied to Zech, "I submitted both letters to the foreign minister. He even showed the second one to the Führer. If you can, without inconvenience, obtain further information of this nature, I should be grateful if you would pass it on to me." There is no publicly available evidence on whether Zech wrote further dispatches to Berlin regarding the Duke of Windsor. Based on the February dispatch alone, though, one might argue that it would prove how the Duke, a major general in the British Army, was in contact with an enemy official and had shared topics discussed by the Allied War Council. A counter-argument, however, would be that Zech simply wrote that the Duke of Windsor has said, the Duke and not the Duke of Windsor has said to me. And if it were the former, how did he hear of this? Just a rumor and hearsay which may not have even happened, or not so clearly as Zech stated? Fortunately, nobody knows the answer to any of this today. It is possible that the Duke may have discussed the Allied War Council meeting with an unknown party, perhaps the intermediary mentioned in the January dispatch, without knowing that the individual was actually a German agent, as spies were everywhere on both sides, even occasionally in prominent positions. And it is noteworthy that the Duke had a long-standing propensity to not really care about formalities, traditions, and in this case perhaps a little lax on secrecy and security, and in all, generally happy to give his thoughts on things, so presumably it was probably more the he talked to someone he shouldn't have, who may or may not have talked to someone else, and it all got back to Zech, assuming any of this happened at all. Stepping away from speculation, what we do know is that Germany's invasion of various surrounding nations was a smashing success, and realistically, such a success did not depend on intelligence willfully provided or carelessly revealed by the Duke. Rather, it should be credited to the plans concocted by Generals von Manstein and Guderian, which called for an armored push through the poorly defended Ardennes sector. Critically, the early incarnation of the plan was drafted in late 1939 and approved by Hitler on February 17, 1940. Therefore, by the time Zech's dispatches had actually been considered by his superiors in early March, the German army had already firmed up their plans, and the Duke's remarks would have made zero difference to anything. With Germany overrunning parts of France, while you might think the Duke and Duchess would head back to safety in Britain, they were still not welcome there. Thus, they first relocated to southern France before crossing the border to Spain. The Windsors then spent some time in Madrid before moving again to Portugal. In both locations, they came into contact with Axis diplomacy and intelligence services while continuing to oppose Britain's participation in the war. Thomas Inskip, Lord Chief Justice of England, warned Winston Churchill that the Duke is well known to be pro-Nazi and he may become the center of intrigue. But just what type of intrigue? According to Professor Urbach from the University of London, during their stay in Madrid, the Windsors met with their friend Javier Bermejillo, a Spanish diplomat. In a report to his superiors, Bermejillo wrote that the Duke had blamed the outbreak of the war on the Jews, the Reds, and the Foreign Office. Following another encounter taking place on June the 25th, the Spanish diplomat reported the Duke's conviction that if England was bombed, peace would follow. Bermejillo claimed that Edward hoped very much for this to happen, as he wants peace at any price. The diplomat's report landed on the desk of Spanish dictator Francisco Franco and then passed on to the Germans. As noted by Professor Urbach, the bombing of Britain started on the 10th of July, which seems to imply that the German Air Force undertook their bombing campaigns almost as if inspired by the Duke of Windsor's words. But here again, while it's entirely possible the Duke really did express these sentiments, as he very openly did want peace for Britain to spare his former people the horror of war, the commonly touted conspiracy that he was actively in support of Germany, or that his words, assuming he really did say them at all, about bombing Britain likely having the effect of pushing the nation to peace, don't really hold up under scrutiny. We should point out that the Luftwaffe did indeed drop 170 bombs on terrestrial targets in South Wales, East Anglia, Southeast and Southwest England from 6:15 a.m. on July the 10th until 2:14 a.m. on July the 11th. This attack, however, was part of what was later called the Battle of Britain, an operation conducted by the Luftwaffe to seize air superiority over the Channel in preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the already planned seaborne invasion of Britain. As the German Air Force lost the duel against the Royal Air Force, as noted, they shifted their focus onto the intensive bombing of military and civilian targets. This campaign, known as the Blitz, started on September the 7th, 1940. The general idea of the conspiracy here, however, is often further put forth owing to the next part of this tale, that the Duke would allegedly bring up the bombing of Britain again after moving to Lisbon, as well as potentially see about gaining German support for his return to Britain. According to police reports uncovered by journalist Paulo Ananciaso, once in Lisbon, the Windsors met with one Ricardo Espirito Santo, a banker with close ties to Nazi Germany. Author Andrew Lowney confirms such ties, stating that British intelligence reports claimed Espirito Santo dealt in stolen goods and that he, in effect, acted as banker to the Nazis. Moreover, the banker was also an informant to the German ambassador in Lisbon, for whom he wrote reports on the Duke of Windsor. What does seem clear is that from their side, the Nazi government was indeed extremely interested in finding an understanding with the Duke and Duchess. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop wrote to his ambassador, "Germany is determined to force England to peace by every means of power, and upon this happening, would be prepared to accommodate any desire expressed by the Duke, especially with a view to the assumption of the English throne by the Duke and Duchess," which indicates that Ribbentrop considered the Windsor as potential puppet monarchs to install on the British throne in case of an Axis victory. Allegedly, German diplomats did discuss such an eventuality with the Duke and Duchess and reported back to Berlin via telegram. However, one such message noted how the Windsors rejected the idea of sitting on the throne, claiming, they replied that according to British Constitution, this was not possible after abdication. As the conspiracy goes anyway, they were allegedly open to reconsider the proposition should the war go in Germany's way. When an agent then remarked the course of the war may produce changes even in the British Constitution, the Duchess, in particular, became very thoughtful. Now, whether that actually happened or not, or what her being thoughtful implied, is not clear. According to Professor Urbach, at this time the Soviet intelligence services also were keeping an eye on the comings and goings of the Windsor home. Soviet spies even allegedly reported back to Moscow that David was conducting negotiations with Hitler to agree on a peace deal and sign a military alliance against the USSR. Of course, evidence that any of that was actually happening does not appear to exist either, other than that the Duke really did want Britain to make peace with the Axis, though all indications, once again, simply being because he wanted Britain and its people protected by getting out of the war, with there not seeming to be any hard evidence at all at any point he had any inclination to try to regain his throne. And indeed on that one, shortly after the war, when the king was facing a potentially life-threatening surgery, it was suggested by some in power that the Duke return to England and start trying to endear himself to the masses in various ways, with the hope that he'd be made king again if King George VI died, rather than the king's young daughter ascending the throne. The Duke, however, noteworthy, chose not to accept this advice and remain where he was in quasi-exile. But going back to the war and all the rumors, as well as just the potential danger the Duke and Duchess were in, given they were not welcome in Britain, Winston Churchill was not going to run any risks, and so he found a brilliant solution to get David out of Europe. Give the man a promotion. The Duke would be appointed governor of the Bahamas so that he and Wallace could reside in the Caribbean islands until the end of the war. According to American historian David Kahn, Ribbentrop, on the other hand, was desperate to keep David in Europe, and so he dispatched to Portugal Walter Schellenberg, one of the top-ranking agents of the SD, the security office within the SS. And so it was that Schellenberg concocted Operation Willie, which bore no relation to a covert plan of the same name my college girlfriend executed with her ex, instead involving inviting the Windsors to a hunting outing near the border with Spain. Once there, a squad of operatives would burst through the border to kidnap the couple and bring them back to Germany. Which we're just saying, if the Germans were having to resort to kidnapping, call us skeptical that the Duke and Duchess were in cahoots with them, especially as the couple refused the invitation, which sent Schellenberg into a spin. The German agent allegedly then scrambled to delay the Windsor's departure to the Bahamas by any means necessary. For example, he convinced the Portuguese police that someone had planted a bomb on the ship sailing out to the Bahamas. He even allegedly bribed David's chauffeur, instructing him to refuse to go to the Caribbean, though we're not sure how he thought that would stop the trip, unless he assumed David, being a royal, couldn't drive a car, or simply hire another driver, or a myriad of other ways to get around the problem. Again, color us skeptical on some of the specifics here. Either way, eventually the couple followed Churchill's instructions and took up their new jobs in Nassau at a safe distance from the grasp of German intelligence, though it wasn't a post he seemingly enjoyed that much, despite literally getting to chill in a tropical paradise while the world was warring away back in Europe and the Pacific. But to each their own. He states he felt the islands were a third-class British colony. As to an explanation of the appointment to nearby United States, Churchill would write to President Roosevelt in July of 1940, "The position of the Duke of Windsor in recent months has been causing His Majesty and His Majesty's government some embarrassment. As though his loyalties are unimpeachable, there is always a backwash of Nazi intrigue which seeks to make trouble about him now that the greater part of the continent is in enemy hands. There are personal and family difficulties about his return to this country. In all the circumstances, it was felt that an appointment abroad might appeal to him, and the Prime Minister has, with His Majesty's cordial approval, offered him the governorship of the Bahamas. His Royal Highness has intimated that he will accept the appointment." On Roosevelt's side, he was aware of all the intrigue surrounding the Duke, and during one visit of the Duke and Duchess to Palm Beach, Florida, he had J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI launch a full investigation on the couple, with the report, now declassified, seeing the FBI's opinion that the Duke was a Nazi sympathizer and may well become King of England once again if Hitler managed to conquer Britain. Of course, whether there was any truth to that is not really clear, and it may well be that the FBI was simply documenting all the other rumors that had been swirling about the exiled Duke, mostly instigated by the Nazis themselves, who really did seem to want to make that happen. In any event, the details of Operation Willie, again the German one, not my college girlfriend and her ex, as well as David's dangerous liaisons with Ribbentrop's men, only fully emerged in 1957 with the publication of the so-called Windsor Files, a subset of top-secret records known as the Marburg Files. That said, although these files were published in 1957, both the British and American governments had been aware of them for years. In fact, in 1953, Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote to President Eisenhower asking his State Department not to include the telegrams in their official history of World War II. Eisenhower agreed, replying to Churchill that intelligence officials believed the telegrams to be a Nazi fabrication, to quote, concocted with some idea of promoting German propaganda and weakening Western resistance. When the files were eventually released to the public in 1957, the Duke of Windsor dismissed their contents as complete fabrications. The publication also elicited a response from the Crown in the form of a statement issued by Her Majesty's Stationery Office. The Duke was subjected to heavy pressure from many quarters to stay in Europe, where the Germans hoped that he would exert influence against the policy of His Majesty's government. His Royal Highness never wavered in his loyalty to the British cause. The German records are necessarily a much tainted source. The only firm evidence which they provide is of what the Germans were trying to do in that matter, and of how completely they failed to do it. The Duke, the royal family, and even some historians also dismissed the authenticity of the Czech dispatches we quoted earlier, claiming they were just similar Nazi propaganda. So what's the truth about the Duke of Windsor? Was he an active traitor, revealing Allied plans to Germany, and even calling for his own motherland to be bombed? The actual evidence available, as we've been alluding to, seems to be not so much. Again, the Duke was not shy about wanting Britain to first stay out of the war and later to make peace with the Axis, but that was seemingly again and again and again simply about trying to protect Britain and its people from a conflict he seemed to feel they had no business getting involved in, rather than making any move to retake his throne or the like. This was a general stance many others, including the majority of Americans before Pearl Harbor, also held. And while he, like many of the era on both sides, seems to have been a rather raging racist, we're just guessing he, again like so many others the world over, quickly began to rethink some things after the full details of the Holocaust were revealed. Although we should note that contrary to popular belief, the world was very well aware of what Hitler and the Nazis were up to on that front even before they began liberating concentration camps. And indeed, Hitler first tried to simply get rid of the Jews by forcing them out, but when most nations very explicitly said, no thanks, we won't accept them, and refused to let many Jews immigrate, Hitler went to Plan B. And most shockingly of all, even when that happened and the world's nations became fully aware of what was happening, they still, on the whole, continued to refuse to let Jews immigrate out of German-held lands, including Britain saying no thanks, with some exceptions for children, but not their parents. However, hearing stories about it and actually seeing video and pictures of the atrocities in the aftermath of the war apparently were two very different things, and the latter finally woke the world up and began changing an awful lot of opinions on so many things. We have a whole almost hour-long video on all of this. See, what did the German public know about the Holocaust during World War II? But so summing up the Duke, seemingly super racist like most of the rest of the world at the time, but otherwise not seemingly a Nazi collaborator, though maybe for a time during the war a Nazi sympathizer. This is a bit unclear, and certainly in the aftermath, both the Duke and Duchess and the British government would have had reason to want to whitewash his image there a bit wherever possible.